Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's DoD Environmental Planning and Conservation webinar series presentation. Today's session is titled Preserving and Interpreting the Department of the Navy's Sunken Military Craft. As a reminder, today's presentation will be recorded and then posted on the Cultural Resources DENIX website under the News and Outreach tab. Today's presenter is Dr. Alexis Catsambis, Branch Head, Underwater Archaeology and Sunken Military Craft, Naval History and Heritage Command. Before we get started, please take a moment to make sure your phones and web browsers are on mute. With that, I will turn it over to Alexis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much, Daniel. As was referenced, my name is Alexis Catsambis. I head the Navy's Underwater Archaeology program here at the Naval History and Heritage Command. And I'd like to thank you very much for taking time to join me this afternoon. My presentation will be divided into three sections. I'll start with addressing my command and the purpose and the mission of the Underwater Archaeology Branch. I'll then discuss some of the underpinning legislation and regulatory work that we do, and then finally conclude with some case studies to illustrate our mission. So the Naval History and Heritage Command is based at the Washington Navy Yard. It is a multifaceted organization whose mission is to preserve and present an accurate history of the U.S. Navy. It's comprised of a number of different elements, including archives, the Navy's operational archives, photographic archives, the Navy's Department Library, a history section, 10 museums that are distributed around the country, and many focus on particular communities. Responsibility for maintaining the USS Constitution, a Navy art collection with 20,000 pieces, a historical artifact collection with close to 300,000 artifacts, a conservation section that is aimed at preserving those artifacts and helping to stabilize them so that they can be presented to the public. And then an underwater archaeology program, which is the topic of today's discussion. So the mission of the branch specifically is to present an accurate history of the U.S. Navy through, as you can see, managing, researching, preserving, and interpreting the Navy's worldwide collection of more than 20,000 sunken military craft. And we do so through pursuing four separate functions: heritage management or historic preservation, archaeological research, conservation and curation of artifacts, and then public outreach and a whole host of different means. To give you a sense of the collection, what you see here are just the shipwrecks, approximately 3,000 of them that are distributed around the world. They date from the American Revolution through to the nuclear age. And as you can see, they're concentrated in areas, either domestic waters where you would expect, such as the Atlantic coast, the Pacific coast, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River, and Hawaii. But equally, almost half of them are located in foreign or international waters throughout the Atlantic, the North Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, and of course, the Pacific, marking the intense activity there in World War II. These tend to be fragile, non-renewable, and multifaceted resources, and they each require an individual management approach. While many may hold historical or cultural value, many serve as historic properties. On the top left there, you see USS Arizona, a National Historic Landmark. They also have other aspects to them. They may serve as maritime graves or war graves. They may contain oil or pose other environmental concerns. They may also contain unexploded ordnance, those public safety hazards, and this is true for sites that span all the way back to the Civil War with black powder explosive. And then more recently, of course, we have the addition of further sensitivities, such as the loss of 2 nuclear-powered submarines that we've suffered. You introduce all of these complexities into an environment that has overlapping jurisdictions and extends globally. And I hope you can understand that it is quite a complex task to manage these resources, and quite a challenging one as well. Contributing to the management is the archaeological research and analysis, and this is our second function. We conduct our own investigations, our own surveys, our own assessments of sites, recoveries of artifacts, etc. But more often than not, these types of activities are in partnership with other collaborators, whether that be other Navy commands, other DoD entities, other federal agencies, state agencies, the private sector, academia, or foreign governments. Our field operations are much richer because of our collaborations. And as I indicated, they sort of span from non-intrusive research, identifying the location of a site, assessing its state of preservation, through to full-scale recoveries. And in our laboratory, which I'll be addressing here shortly, we have artifact collections representing more than 40 sites. Now, in addition to our own organic or partner operations, the branch also administers an archaeological research permitting program. And this is intended for external parties who wish to disturb a Navy sunken military craft for archaeological, historical, or educational purposes, to request permission to do so under a controlled environment. And we've issued approximately 70 permits facilitating that research to date. What you see in the images here are on the top left, the remains of the Royal Savage, which was a Revolutionary War vessel that was recovered from Lake Champlain in the mid-20th century. Those are the timbers and structure of the actual ship. We were able to reacquire them. We laser scanned them. We created what you see in the forefront of that image, illustrations of them, and studying them, and have virtually reconstructed the ship based on those timbers, which are also accompanied by thousands of artifacts as well. On the top right, you see the Civil War submarine H.L. Hunley, which I'll address later on as a case study, but that represents probably the most significant full-scale recovery that we've undertaken. And then I highlight on the bottom that we engage through scientific diving or Navy diving operations, our sites, but also through remotely operated vehicles. And to the bottom right is USS Conestoga, which is a shipwreck discovered in a National Marine Sanctuary off of California. And together with NOAA, we were able to conduct an investigation of the site, document it, positively confirm it, and provide closure actually to families of those lost in the early to mid-20th century on the ship. Now, our responsibility isn't solely to the ships and the sites themselves, but also extend toward the associated contents of those vessels. And so we have approximately 34,000 artifacts in our care here at the Washington Navy Yard. At any given point, approximately 250 artifacts are in some form of treatment. We have conservators who specialize in the treatment of waterlogged archaeological artifacts. In fact, we probably have the leading laboratory in the federal government dedicated to the subject. You see an image of part of the lab on the top left here. And on the top right, you actually see one of our conservators who is treating a trumpet that was recovered from USS Houston, lost in early 1942 off the coast of Indonesia. Now, though we do have a curation facility, our primary goal with these artifacts, beyond stabilization, analysis, and documentation, is their interpretation. And so we have an extensive loan program. As you can see, approximately a third of our artifacts are on loan to museums around the country, both within the Navy system, outside of the Navy system, and in fact, some are even located abroad. I will mention that the laboratory isn't just aimed at stabilizing artifacts and allowing them to be documented and interpreted, but it also performs analysis that contributes to management of the sites. It's quite often the case that artifacts recovered in the field are not fully either able to be interpreted or don't fully show the knowledge or data they contain within them until you're in the laboratory and you're able to analyze them, remove concretion, take fine photographs. And so together with other data points, if we are able to associate particular artifacts to a particular wreck, that means we can ascribe an identity to that wreck. And so I hope you're beginning to see that all three of the functions I've discussed so far are interrelated. And of course, as is the fourth. Now, we engage in public outreach and education primarily to share the story of the U.S. Navy with the public, as well as present and future sailors. However, more narrowly, focus for the underwater archaeology branch is aimed at enhancing public appreciation and understanding of sunken military craft, submerged cultural resources. Because we hope that with that increased appreciation and understanding will come increased site preservation. We do have, as I'll note in a moment here, some deterrence in the form of the Sunken Military Craft Act to prevent the unauthorized disturbance of sites. But it is perhaps more effective, more important, and certainly reaches a greater audience to focus on the public outreach and education side of the equation. So with that, conclude the introductory summary of our program, and I'll move over to discussing how we fall into the legal and regulatory framework that you may or may not be more familiar with, as well as certain elements that perhaps are more custom tailored to the submerged cultural resources and sunken military craft. And I'll begin with discussing the Sunken Military Craft Act proper. So in 2004, Congress passed the statute that essentially codified that title to sunken military craft remained with the U.S. government, regardless of the passage of time, regardless of location, unless, of course, those individual sunken military craft had been expressly divested. That means they had been sold or title had otherwise been transferred. So title is codified. The U.S. government owns its sunken military craft. The next step was to say these sites can't be disturbed through unauthorized activities. And that not only applies to U.S. sunken military craft, irrespective of their location, but it also applies to foreign sunken military craft in U.S. waters. The reason for that, I think, was hinted in the slide I showed earlier with the map. We have a number of sunken military craft in international and foreign waters. We'd like to see those respected, and we'd like to ensure that our equities are protected, our sites are not disturbed, even if they lie in foreign waters. And one way to do that is to encourage reciprocal treatment. And so by protecting foreign sunken military craft in U.S. waters, we directly hope that carries over into our sites abroad. Now, the Act also established civil penalties for violations. These can be significant. $100,000 a day, each day constituting separate violation, confiscation of the vessel used to disturb a site, liability for damages, conservation of artifacts recovered, remediation of the site that was disturbed, things of that nature. Now, once it established ownership, restricted unauthorized disturbance, the statute also opened up a mechanism through which to pursue archaeological, historical, and educational research on these sites. And so certain secretaries, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard, are empowered to put in place a permitting program to do so. The Department of the Navy is the only service that at present has implementing regulations and established a permitting program. I should note the U.S. Coast Guard is considering whether to partner with the U.S. Navy to co-manage sunken military craft, and the other services could request of the Secretary of the Navy to incorporate their wrecks in the Navy's program. And that is a provision included in the regulations because the statute itself also allows for foreign sovereign to request that their wrecks in U.S. waters are incorporated into the Navy's program. And then finally, I should note that actions of the United States are exempt from these prohibitions or permitting requirements. Now, I've used the term sunken military craft quite a bit thus far, and I just wanted to quickly define it. Effectively, it encompasses any sunken warship, any naval auxiliary, or any other vessel. This is the third category that was owned or operated by a government on military non-commercial service when it sank. In addition to the watercraft, it also extends to aircraft and military aircraft specifically, and military spacecraft, as well as the associated contents of those two categories of military craft. And to be more specific, associated contents includes equipment, cargo, as well as the remains and personal effects of crew and passengers, as long as they're all associated within the debris field of the wreck. Now, the sunken military craft deck may be the leading statute that we operate under, but I also wanted to note briefly that there are a host of other statutes and regulations and Navy instructions that we operate under. Specifically to the Navy, obviously the Navy Cultural Resources Program, there's an instruction that pertains to human remains associated with sunken military craft, and the Secretary of the Navy has established that the sea is a fit and final resting place for sailors lost on such vessels. Obviously, compliance with environmental and historic preservation laws and regulations and instructions, and then, of course, the implementation of the permitting program I addressed earlier. All these come together to form the Navy's approach to submerged cultural resources and sunken military craft. And effectively, the Navy's preferred policies that they remain in place and undisturbed. As I indicated earlier, the sea is a fit and final resting place for those lost on sunken military craft. And we do administer a permitting program to provide controlled access to historic ship and aircraft wrecks, specifically though for archaeological, historical, and educational purposes. And then finally, as I indicated earlier, foreign sunken military craft can be incorporated into the Navy's program, and there are protocols for exercising those enforcement provisions that are captured in the Sunken Military Craft Act itself. Now, that brings us to the third portion of the lecture, which is case studies, and sort of highlights how all these things fit together. And I'll begin with the very first one, and I mean the very first one. The CSS Alabama was discovered in 1984 by the French Navy in approximately 200 feet of water off Cherbourg, France. About 5 years later, the United States and France signed an agreement that recognized that CSS Alabama was an important heritage resource of both nations, and established a joint French and American scientific committee to oversee the archaeological investigation of the wreck. Part of that agreement required the U.S. government to care and conserve the artifacts that were recovered from the ship. And the need to do so was what spurred what eventually became the Conservation Laboratory of the Underwater Archaeology Branch. And so this very first case study was actually the reason for our being. And of course, the scope of the program has expanded significantly since its focus on this particular wreck. But it is very much the beginnings of underwater archaeology for the U.S. Navy. Now, moving to the present day, I have 5 or 6 slides here to share with you, each dedicated to different shipwreck or aircraft wreck. And I'm going to proceed chronologically, so the very first one in time, that is. And so the very first one takes us back to the American Revolution. This is the gunboat Spitfire that was sunk in Lake Champlain shortly after or during the Battle of Valker Bay. What you're looking at on the top right is an archaeological site plan developed by Lake Champlain Maritime Museum, who also developed the photogrammetric model that you're seeing in the center of your screens. That is actually a three-dimensional model of the ship that was developed following the processing of thousands of photographs. And what you hope can appreciate is the extraordinary state of preservation of the ship itself. You see the mast still standing. You see the bow gown still in place. The ship itself is partially buried in mud, and you can see that silt has also come to cover a lot of the interior structure. But we fully anticipate that the level of preservation is actually even higher in the portions of the vessel that are currently buried. Part of the reason for the preservation being so good are the cold, fresh, and dark waters of Lake Champlain, where it's located. It's an extraordinary rare site. You don't frequently find wrecks of this age in such condition. It also is the last extant wreck associated with the Battle of Valker Bay and the Revolutionary War, located in the lake. Most of these, including the Royal Savage I referenced earlier, were brought out of the lake in the mid-20th century. A sister vessel to this is actually the Philadelphia at the Smithsonian. And so the vessel, as you can see, has been exceptionally documented in situ. However, given the 250th anniversary of its sinking, of the nation, there is increased interest in the particular wreck. So at the moment, NHHC is considering that interest in potentially undertaking some further excavation on the ship and what that would look like. In this case, disturbance of the site would be for research purposes and for commemorative purposes, and would probably take place in 2026. And moving through time, the second case study is the Civil War submarine H.L. Hunley. It sunk in 1864 off Charleston, South Carolina, in its attempt to help break the Union blockade of the port. It was the first submarine to sink an enemy vessel in combat. USS Housatonic was attacked by Hunley, quickly sunk. However, Hunley did not make it back to shore. It was finally discovered in the mid-1990s. And then in the year 2000, August, it was recovered from the seafloor and was taken to a custom designed and made vat in North Charleston in what is currently at Clemson University, the Warren Lash Conservation Center at Clemson University. I hope you note that it was recovered in 2000 and it's still undergoing its final stages of conservation, because that is exemplifies truly how important conservation treatment is to recovered submerged cultural resources, and how intensive in terms of time and resources, financial resources, it can, what it can require. For a period of about 6 months after recovery, it was the interior was excavated, 17 tons of material removed, including all 8 sets of human remains found within. The submarine had a crank system where each man would help effectively propel the screw, and then it had a spar in the front, and you can see that in the archaeological site plan on the top right, at the end of which was an explosive torpedo at the time. But it did not have any sort of self-propelling mechanism. It was simply positioned at the end of the spar, and the submarine would penetrate or approach the hull, the enemy hull, and the impact would detonate the explosive. So exceptionally state of preservation within the submarine, and a tremendous effort to conserve and analyze the material, as well as the human remains, which were ultimately, after forensic anthropological study, reinterred in a Civil War cemetery in Charleston. Right now, the contents have all been conserved and studied, and the submarine itself is in the final phases of conservation, after which point they will move forward towards being displayed in a museum, hopefully in the immediate vicinity. So in this case, the recovery was for preservation purposes. The discovery of the wreck brought such attention to it, and it was only 4 miles offshore in a few dozen feet of water, very accessible, that the only way to protect this site at the time was to actually engage in its recovery. Now, another Civil War site, the CSS Georgia, has a different story. It too sunk in 1864, and it is located in the Savannah River. But this represents, in some ways, just the rapid pace of technological innovation during the Civil War in terms of naval construction. And as you can see in the image on the top, it's akin to a monitor class vessel. So what you're seeing is railroad iron that is interlaced that helps serve as the armor of the ship. And then you see guns closer to the waterline. And indicative of how experimentally new this design was, it ended up proving that the vessel couldn't maneuver or self-propel itself effectively. So it ended up serving the purposes of a floating battery, trying to protect the city of Savannah from the Union advance. Ultimately, when the Union advance came, the vessel itself was scuttled, and it found its way at the bottom of the Savannah River in what ultimately became the ship channel that led to the modern day port in Savannah. As the Panama Canal was expanded in recent years, that sparked a flurry of activity up and down the Atlantic coast and the Gulf of Mexico for what harbors and ports could accommodate larger vessels coming through. And so that prompted the need to dredge and expand ship channels and harbors. What you're seeing at the bottom of this screen are the remains of CSS Georgia. And they happen to lie on the very edge of the former ship channel, but entirely within the boundaries of the expanded ship channel that the Corps of Engineers intended to dredge. The image you see on the bottom of the screen is constituted of millions of individual points. It's called a multi-beam data set, and it effectively you use sound to map the riverbed and create this 3D model of what is there. But you're also seeing scars. Those scars on the riverbed come from the dredging activity that preceded this project. And so you can see that the wreck site was just on the edge of the original ship channel, and in fact, dredging operations associated with that earlier ship channel expanded and at times impacted the shipwreck itself. In order to undertake what was a full-scale recovery, because in this case there was no avoidance, there was no ability to change the ship channel course, it had to come through here, and everything would be impacted by the dredges. Between 2013 and 2017, the Corps of Engineers partnered with NHHC to engage in that full-scale recovery of this particular shipwreck. And that included cannon, that included a propeller, that included the casemate itself. And it was a very challenging project. More than 150 tons of material was recovered. Ultimately, some of that material was covered, documented, and repositioned in the river in a similar environment in a protected, secure area adjacent to the ship channel. But many, many artifacts have now completed the conservation treatment and are housed in our curation facility waiting for a museum to express an interest so that we can put them on exhibit. So in this instance, the recovery was fully the result of a mitigation of a major project, infrastructure project. Now moving forward into World War I, this is a recent project this year. We're looking at the destroyer Jacob Jones, which was actually the first destroyer sunk by an enemy. In 1917, it was sunk by a German submarine off the Isles of Scilly in the UK. It's a historically significant wreck. It's also probably one of the greatest concentrations of the loss of life with a single ship for the U.S. Navy in the Great War, if not the greatest loss of life associated with a single wrecking event. So in 2022, a group of technical divers from the UK called Dark Star were able to identify the location of this wreck, collected some video and photos of the site, and then contacted both the US Embassy and NHHC to inform us of their discovery. We were very grateful for the responsible response that group showed to the discovery, and it positioned us to then take action, so that together with the UK's National Oceanography Centre, we were able to collect multi-beam data, which is the same type of data I described earlier for CSS Georgia, over the hull of Jacob Jones. What you see in the image on the bottom to the left is the bow, to the right is the stern. And in fact, if you're able to make the mental leap here, there's a significant damage in the stern of the vessel, and there's a linear feature that comes down, curves around, and is at the forefront of the image. That feature actually is the propeller shaft of Jacob Jones. To give you a sense of just how massive the extent of damage in that area of the hull is, and that's the result of unfortunately depth charges going off as the ship was sinking at the time. All this to say, we were able to capture and document this site. It's a new discovery. There was no evident disturbance, and we also located, or rather I should say that Dark Star located the bell of the ship. We've had instances in the past where ships in the area had artifacts taken from them, and bells tend to be emblematic, symbolic, evocative, powerful artifacts. And so in order to prevent the bell of Jacob Jones from being pilfered, earlier this year we partnered with an American consulting company, a British consulting company, and the Ministry of Defense who ultimately recovered the bell of Jacob Jones on our behalf. The bell was transferred over to the VCNO in April in a ceremony from the Second Sea Lord, and then flew to Andrews Air Force Base, where we met it that evening, and it's now in our conservation laboratory. It'll eventually be placed on display at the new National Museum of the U.S. Navy, prominently as a testament to the crew and the ship and the Navy's role in World War I. What we're missing at the moment is systematic high definition video documentation of the wreck, and that's what we are hoping to actually obtain here in the coming weeks through an ROV survey that's planned. I have two more case studies, and then I'll be concluding. This is something different. As you can tell, it's an aircraft, not a ship. This is a TBD-1 Devastator. Devastators were prominent, but also quickly overcome early in World War II. 129 Devastators were made, of which none exist in museums or private collections above water at present. There are a handful of examples that exist underwater. This particular one is both exceptionally rare and historically significant. It's one of two aircraft that were lost in the Republic of the Marshall Islands, Jalloh Lagoon. No human losses, thankfully no aviators were lost when these aircraft were jettisoned. But They are in a very good state of preservation, and they represent one of the very first sorties in the Pacific Theater. They were discovered in 2002, or this particular one was, and it has since been thoroughly documented, including through the use of underwater green laser that you see on the top left, and extensive photogrammetric modeling, which has produced the image on the bottom there that you see. It is presently under review for a possible recovery. And this would be a paradigm shift. This would be an archaeological recovery of a historic aircraft that is then conserved and presented in the new National Museum of the U.S. Navy as itself, as the historic fabric of the aircraft, as allowing it to tell its own story, not as an archetype, not reconstructed or otherwise restored. If it moves to pass, this recovery would be undertaken for both research purposes, because we truly have no extant examples of these, but also primarily perhaps for public education purposes associated with the Indian Museum. And then my final case study is the USS Indianapolis. We're in World War II, very end of World War II, and the ship is sunk by a Japanese submarine, obviously, in very deep water, 5,500 meters of water in the Philippine Sea. It is truly a significant war grave and a significant ship, and given its inaccessibility until recently, hopes for finding it were rather slim. However, an external partner, Vulcan, proceeded in the last decade to search for exploration purposes and identify the locations of World War II shipwrecks in the Pacific. Vulcan was founded by the late Paul Allen, and his father had served in World War II. This was a testament to that service. We were able to help partner with the group, provide support, access to records, develop potential search plans. But they themselves and independently were extraordinarily successful in locating a number of sites, including USS Indianapolis. So underlying the two photographs in the front, you have the side scan image that shows on the bottom left the main hull of the wreck, and then on the very, very top right, the bow of Indianapolis. So this deep water exploration is fairly new, and it shows how our policies and our thinking continues to evolve, because locating this site and others like it, we were clearly confronted with a particular set of circumstances. This is an iconic vessel. It's associated with an event of great importance. It had just delivered parts of the atomic bomb. There is great loss of life that is tied to this ship. It maintains an extraordinary state of preservation and can be, to a large degree, sufficiently archaeologically investigated through non-intrusive documentation means. And it exists in an environment that is both largely inaccessible to humans and which itself preserves it to a great extent. And so putting all these factors together led us to creating a new policy of sites of extraordinary character. And there are a handful, and I mean a handful, 5 or 6 out of 3,000, that we have come to the realization that, seeing as we're the perpetual stewards of these wrecks, that they should not be disturbed until and unless there's a material change in their status. And so, whereas we would, for example, approve non-intrusive research on the site that met the parameters, this and other sites of extraordinary character would not be disturbed by the Navy or through permitting means. So that brings me to my concluding remarks, and I'll be brief. I hope that through these case studies, I've been able to illustrate that we have an expansive mission covering heritage management, compliance, interdisciplinary research, preservation, interpretation functions. And this mission itself is further complicated by a series of multifaceted cultural and natural marine resources, cover a broad geographic range, multiple jurisdictions. And though the history of the U.S. Navy in the grand scheme of things may be fairly short, it transpired over a period of intense naval development and innovation. And so from a cultural resources standpoint, you're addressing sites that look like the one on the bottom right here, which is essentially a ballast pile from a historic wooden shipwreck, to World War I era submarines, such as the one you see on the left here in an ortho mosaic called H-1 Seawolf in Mexico, to very large destroyers from World War II, such as the USS Emmons, which you see on the top here, to aircraft and through the nuclear age, right? So putting it all together, though we have a specialized training and expertise in our ranks, we remain a small team, and so this leads us to really focus heavily on collaborations and partnerships in order to accomplish our mission. And I'll conclude with that. And, thank you very much for your attention and your time, and I'd be very happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Alexis. We will now begin the Q&A portion of this presentation. Participants may use the raise hand function and wait to be called before unmuting and asking their question. Participants may also submit their questions to the chat. As a reminder, this presentation and the Q&A are being recorded. Back over to you, Alexis. Looks like we have a question in the chat from Jennifer. Jennifer asks, how do you monitor disturbance of the deep sea wrecks?
It's a very good question. Obviously, given the scope of the collection, 3,000 shipwrecks, 17,000 aircraft wrecks across geographic jurisdictions, we are not able to perpetually monitor every site, right? So we rely there too on collaborations with local authorities, other governments, other partners, the diving community, the research community, to help inform us of developments. We do have active interest in particular sites that may be under threat or may be particularly sensitive, fragile, important. And so we do actively take steps to monitor the condition of those vessels. Oftentimes in partnership with other Navy commands as part of training operations, for example. One of the benefits that we have is that we work within an organization that has multiple different missions. And so if we can dedicate a dive qualification mission, for example, to the investigation of a historic shipwreck, that benefits our understanding and our knowledge of that particular site, as well as it benefits training for active duties divers who get to experience real world operations as opposed to less engaging targets. So it does take a village. There are mechanisms for remote monitoring. There are mechanisms for on-site visitation, but the scope far exceeds the capabilities and the resources. And so I would like to conclude the answer to that question by, again, accentuating the importance of public education, because we can have the deterrence and we can pursue deterrence and enforcement and monitoring, but really the focus should be, from our perspective, on building appreciation for these sites so that they aren't disturbed to the degree that otherwise they would be.
Our next question is from Dan. Dan asks, does the group work with DPAA for search and recovery of MIAs at these sites?
It's a very good question as well. So DPA, the Department of Defense POW/MIA accounting agency, and NHAC have a long history of working together from the days where it was JPAC. And um, our missions are both aligned and slightly different. We're, we're responsible for management of a site as a whole. And so that includes historic preservation, environmental matters, the preservation of any remains. And as I noted earlier, the Secretary of the Navy's position is that the sea is a fit and final resting place. And so we would not authorize an external party to go and to disturb a site for the purposes of recovering remains. DPA's mission is to recover human remains from past conflicts, and so um, where we come together is on their disturbance of potential aircraft, naval aircraft, in order to recover remains of aviators. And in those instances, we have a very good and close working relationship with our partners at DPA's Partner and Innovation Office to ensure that coordination of those missions and that those missions are executed in a manner that try and meet both agencies' objectives. It is a challenge, but it also, over the years, is something that we've been able to address and improve and refine.
Adam asks, Dr. Catsambis, can you explain how privateer vessels from the Revolutionary War and War of 1812 fit into SMCA, if at all?
Very good question. So I believe I'm still sharing my screen. Is that correct?
You are.
So when I was describing the Sunken Military Craft Act, I mentioned that the term includes any sunken warship, as well as any naval auxiliary. And those are two distinct independent categories. There's also a third category for which the Act applies, and those are other vessels that were owned or operated by a government on military and non-commercial service when they sink. That is a tricky category, less clear perhaps than the first two. And as you go back in time, the American Revolution, War of 1812, Civil War, and through perhaps the 19th century, it is really a case-by-case assessment as to whether a particular vessel was operated or owned by a government on military non-commercial service when they sink. And so it could be that, for example, you may be looking even more recent past at a Liberty ship that was owned by presently MARAD, but operated under charter. It could be that you're looking at a privateer from earlier times that had a letter of marque, in which case one could argue it was operating at the behest of a government. So it is certainly a case-by-case assessment, but it may very well apply to certain privateers. It could well apply to foreign sunken military craft of historic times that may have been perceived to also serve other functions, but were operating under the guidance of the Crown and under naval officers, etc. The concept of a warship, of course, has changed over the decades and the centuries. And so as we go back in time, it becomes all the more important to look at cases on an independent basis. And the challenge with that is oftentimes those are also the cases that have records that are harder to access or haven't made it to us in the present day.
If I may take the liberty to ask a question of my own,
Sure.
how different is a freshwater recovery versus a saltwater recovery or expedition?
Yes, and if I may slightly tweak your question, The focus is more perhaps on the degree of preservation of the material, which then influences the nature of the research or the type of a recovery that may apply. So typically in fresh water, um, the degradation of historic structures of a submerged resource uh, is less than in saltwater. That doesn't apply uniformly. You may have seen, for example, in recent years, discoveries in the Black Sea that have unearthed remarkable Byzantine era or earlier shipwrecks that are in exceptional state of preservation. And in that instance, it's because the level of oxygen in the water is so low that wood-boring organisms um, don't survive to the degree that would allow them to then degrade the shipwreck itself. And so here I'm introducing another parameter, which is the material that the ship itself was made of. On the whole, and one of the challenges that our conservators have to face is that ships were complex artifacts and made of many different materials and potentially reflected the greatest technological innovation of their time. Um, that interaction of the artifacts and the interaction with each other, and then the interaction of that whole with the environment really leads to case by case, again, assessments of corrosion and degradation and preservation rates. And then when it comes time to try and conserve artifacts that are recovered, um, oftentimes you have to disarticulate the artifacts into individual materials and then try and rearticulate the whole so that you treat each component with different means, different chemicals, different processes.
Dan asks, perhaps I missed mention of this at the beginning, but does the group spend time conducting exploratory recon in areas for any sunken military craft or primarily focus on location, finding, recovery of known and suspected sunken craft?
Hmm. I'd say yes. However, it is all a matter of prioritization. And we've recently taken a close look at the reasons why we engage in field operations. And there are a host of those. One may be because we're fostering some sort of management responsibility. A new discovery is made, like in the case of Jacob Jones, and we need to positively confirm that that wreck is USS Jacob Jones, because by that positive confirmation, legal protections apply that otherwise would. There may be commemorative reasons, as I indicated in the case of the Spitfire, where a potential recovery might be pursued, and documentation preceding that might be certainly of the essence. But there may also be opportunistic uh, partnerships. For example, there may be external researchers who are considering mapping or investigating a region, have a platform of opportunity, and among the various other wrecks that they are pursuing, there may be 2 or 3 Navy wrecks. And so in those instances, we are keen to partner with other organizations, learn from them, learn new techniques, new technologies that might apply. And so we are part of a broader area survey that has a Navy tie or interest to it. And then I'll add to that we also engage in broader surveys because we do suspect that there are Navy sites there. Lake Michigan, for example, is believed to hold dozens of World War II era aircraft that were there for training operations. Obviously, the same would apply off Pensacola, and then also in the Chesapeake, the NAS Pax River. And in fact, we have a project, a long-term project that we're pursuing where we're tying back to your earlier question. We're surveying those 3 regions and comparing the state of preservation of the aircraft to determine if fresh, brackish, and seawater really affect the life of these resources. So I'll pause there.
As a reminder, participants may use the raise hand function and wait to be called before unmuting and asking their questions, or participants may submit their questions to the chat.
I can also add one more thing to the previous question, if I may, while others may be thinking of their own. Part of our mission is to support the Navy as a technical advisor and center of expertise for submerged cultural resources. And so it may very well fall within our mission scope to help support a Navy command's survey of an installation for resources that are not necessarily sunken military craft, but for the purposes of accounting and inventorying of submerged cultural resources within their area of responsibility.
Morgan asks, have you worked or coordinated on any sites in U.S. waters that are foreign owned? If so, do you have any examples you can share?
Yes. So we have certainly approached this from a legal and management standpoint. The status of foreign sunken military craft in U.S. waters, as I referenced earlier, is something that is important to us in hopes of fostering reciprocity. But there are also multiple cases of, for example, British vessels from the Revolutionary War, French vessels of exploration. Um, if you didn't know, there are more than 40 German U-boats lost in U.S. waters. Um, and so there are certainly have been cases of research performed on foreign sunken military craft. However, our intent and our strict protocol, I would say, is that we always partner with that foreign sovereign, or we always seek their permission to either foster the research or participate in the research. And then there are also instances where artifacts recovered from foreign sunken military crafts without authorization find their way back to us. And so in those instances, we try and conserve them and stabilize them, and then seek to return them to the rightful owners.
Looks like we are just about at time. Alexis, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share?
I would like to thank all of you for your time and your interest. And I'll harken back to what I said earlier about collaborations and partnerships. If there are any opportunities that you see out there, please feel free to reach back to us. We'd love to work with you.
Well, thank you very much, Alexis, for sharing your insights and experiences. This concludes today's presentation. A recording of this session will be posted on the Cultural Resources DENIX website under News and Outreach. Thank you again to everyone for joining us, and thank you again, Alexis, and everyone have a great rest of your day.